Good evening. Uh, Please remember to silence your cell phones and other electronic devices. Our speaker this evening is Kostas Mrsiadis, whom many of you know. Kostas is Professor Emeritus of Comparative and Greek Literature from Westchester University. He's published numerous books, articles, and translations of both modern and ancient Greek literature, including his translation of Nikos Kazantzakis' play Odysseus, a Verse Tragedy, which he and his wife Linda used to craft the script for the play reading that was performed here this past May by a group of residents. Last November, Kostas did a series of 3 lectures on reading the graphic novel. This evening's talk is a result of a resident's request that he discuss Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel, MAUS. As an interesting coincidence, Art Spiegelman is our resident Lillian Spiegelman's cousin. I give you Kostas Mrsiadis.
I want to thank Richard Newman and John Mulvihill for all the logistics that it takes to set up this presentation. So they did a lot of work with advertising and setting up the computers, etc. So tonight I'm going to show mostly how one looks at a graphic novel. And I'm using Spiegelman's MAUS because it won the Pulitzer Prize. And it's not just a good graphic novel, but it's a good novel. Okay. So, the novel was published in 2 parts. MAUS 1, My Father Bleeds History, which came out in 1986, and MAUS 2, And Here My Troubles Began, which came out in 1991. And actually, I'm not going to talk about this, but MAUS is merely the story of the classic journey, which is, of course, the first classic journey is that of the Odyssey. So it can be read as a modern Odyssey. Because if you look even at the beginning of the Homeric Odyssey, as I show up here, the first line, Andra mi enepe musa polytropon os mala pola plankthi, which means that sing news of the man of many ways, who suffered much on his far journeys, which is exactly what the Odyssey is about. It's about a man who suffers for many years before returning home eventually. And that's what this is about. But the value of MAUS, and the reason it's a great work of art, is the way it weaves 3 different levels of meaning, 3 different narrative levels throughout the novel, and makes it look as a continuous story. And the 3 levels I list here are the main narrative, which is that of Spiegelman's father's experiences. His name is Vladek Spiegelman, who spent time in Auschwitz and lived through all those horrors and was able to return at the end of the war. That's the main narrative that the novel touches on, and it's very much like the story of Odysseus himself. And then you have another narrative at the same time, which is the story of the son, the author himself, Art Spiegelman. The son's attempt to understand his survivor father's post in Auschwitz, and the narrative, which is very much like the Telemachus narrative in the Odyssey, which talks about Odysseus' son. And the third level, which is very interesting, is the story of a second-generation Holocaust survivor, that is Art Spiegelman again, the artist, who grapples with how he might represent the Holocaust. So at the same time that he's telling the story of his father and also dealing with his feelings towards his father, the first two levels, at the same time he is commenting on the very story and saying to himself, can the Holocaust be told? Can anyone ever write about the Holocaust? So these are the three levels that are woven throughout the work. And as I said, its value is in how well he does it and how he keeps these three levels going throughout the 296-page work. What I am going to talk about today is what Spiegelman mentions at the bottom, where he says, I'm literally giving a form to my father's words and narratives, and that form for me has to do with panel size, panel rhythms, and visual structures of the page, so that a page is a very specific and significant unit. It's not just a stream of panels after another. So I want to show how one goes about reading a work that's made up with words and pictures. And the basic unit of a graphic novel is the page layout, the page. The page is like a paragraph in a regular novel. And the page layout is made up of panels or frames and rows. There are so many rows on a page, and each row has panels. Those can be seen as the sentence. So you have so many sentences per page that make up the paragraph that creates a thought, a unit. So everything depends on this page layout, and here you have an example of a page layout. And you notice that there are 4 rows. Each row here, well, the first 3 rows have 2 panels each of various sizes. And the last row has 1 panel. The graphic novel is very similar in many ways to cinema, to film. And the thing that distinguishes the two mostly is that in a graphic novel, the screen or the panel changes sizes, whereas in film, the screen remains the same, the size remains the same throughout the performance. Here the screen expands. Sometimes it's horizontal, sometimes it's vertical. Some panels are very short, some are very long. And they each mean something. The size goes into the analysis of what is going on. Each panel is made up of words and images. And the words are contained in balloons, as they're called, those round things at the top that point to the speaker in the panel. And the narrative part, the narration, is usually in boxes at the top or at the bottom of each panel. I have something that points to those, if I have it here. Yes, there's the balloons, and then the narration is here if something is being narrated, or it can come at the bottom of each frame. You also notice that the shading changes from panel to panel. This panel here doesn't have any borders around it, any frame. It's open. That's because it's at the present and it takes place after the war, where the people in it are not confined anymore. They're not in prison, they're free. So the panel is open. Here, when the characters talk about their past, this is Vladik here, speaking to his son about his experiences, and his son, Art Spiegelman, is holding a recorder, recording what his father is saying. They're sitting in the Catskills someplace, under an umbrella. They're in dark here because it's a sunny day, and they're talking. And as they're talking, we see what Vladik is saying, the experiences he had. Notice how short this particular frame is. because it shows the camps and how tight everything is, how imprisoned they are. There's a border around it, and the shading is darker. When the frame becomes larger, as it is here, it's making a statement, an emphasis. So here you see what's going on. They're talking about waiting in line to get fed, to get soup. And then you see them here again, smaller frames eating. So we go from the present to the past, back to the present, where son and father are speaking, and then you have the large panel here, which is the result, the statement that the page layout makes, like in a paragraph. This is the thesis statement, which is that they don't get enough food, and as a result, they're waiting to die, and you see dead bodies on the side. So that's the basic unit of a graphic novel. Panels, rows, and also then there is a little section between many of these frames, like the one here, which is called a gutter. And that's very important in a graphic novel because it tells you about the amount of time that has passed. What's the time between this frame as it juxtaposed to this one? That's what that does, and that varies. Sometimes there aren't any gutters, which is interpreted a little different because here, what you actually have are people speaking in the present, and imposed on this particular larger frame is this smaller frame of what they're talking about, and that's why you don't have a gutter. There's also a rhythm to this. There's a meter to the graphic novel, like there is in all good prose and poetry. And the rhythm here is usually noted as the number of rows and the number of frames. You see it here. We have 4 rows and 7 frames. And what follows is a notation to tell you how those frames are arranged, and that can become more complicated because it not only shows that there are 2 frames here or panels, 2 here, 2 here, and 1 here for 7, but it shows you when a gutter appears. So the first row doesn't have a gutter, the second one doesn't, the second one does, the third one doesn't, and the fourth has 1 frame. That becomes important, as you'll see later, because that's how you determine the meter of the entire work. If you go through every page of the novel and do this, count, as I did here, you can determine what the meter is. And in a good work, there is a meter, that is poetry, there is structure, and that's what makes it readable and good. Also, in Art Spiegelman specifically, there are 7 things that he does in most of his work that distinguishes him from other artists. First of all, he uses black and white drawings almost exclusively. Many comics have color, but usually color is not done by the author himself. There's someone called colorist who is responsible for putting in color. So this is the work of the artist himself. Spiegelman also uses diagrams throughout, as you'll see. Now, why diagrams? Because diagrams give more of a realistic look to what he's trying to do. He's telling the story of the Holocaust, and he's doing it in comic book form. Diagrams make it look more realistic. The use of difficult animals to represent different nationalities. He uses mice to represent Jews, cats to represent the Germans, the Nazis, pigs to represent the Poles, dogs to represent Americans, and a few other types of animals if other nationalities happen to come in. But mostly those are the main one. Then we have manipulation of the reader's perspective via eye movement, that is angles, just like in film. Sometimes you see things from above, sometimes from the side, and they all create certain, bring out certain psychological feelings in the characters. The various sizes of panels mean a great deal. If you have a train, you might have a horizontal panel like this, so you can see the whole thing, if it's necessary that way. Or if you want to show height, you can have a vertical panel. If you want to show great movement, you can have a series of very small, tight panels. If you want to show excitement, the panels become more existentialist and jagged, as you'll see later on. He also uses photographs. Most photographs that he uses are cartoon-type photographs, but you'll see later that he does use some real photographs. And real photographs, of course, shock the reader into knowing that this is real thing that happened to real people and not just animal characters. And the juxtaposition of past and present, which is very important, because much of the novel takes place in the Catskill or in Rego Park, Queens, New York, where Vladik lives, or sometimes in Florida. And the rest of it takes place in Germany in the early 40s and late 30s. And he jumps from one to the other. Now, that's of interest too, because instead of diving into the Holocaust, he always comes up for air periodically by coming back to the present and seeing the characters talk about what's going on. And that makes easier to take a story that is full of horrors, as you'll see. So the way he manipulates past and present becomes of interest and importance. This shows you how we derive at the meter. As I said, every graphic novel has to have a meter. So I have two sample pages here. The first sample page, this one, shows that you go through 296 pages, page by page, and you do this 296 times, and you create something like this, where each page shows what the meter is like. That is, how many panels are there on the page, how many rows are on each page, and how those particular panels are arranged. Now, if you do this throughout the 296 pages, you come up with certain results that can be analyzed later on. And what you find in doing that, let me see if I have those results here. Yeah. Have to give I don't remember all the percentages right off. Okay. What you find out is that in MAUS 1, remember this was done in 2 volumes, MAUS 1 and MAUS 2. And it was done in 2 volumes. It wasn't intended to be in 2 volumes, but in 1986, a movie came out called A Mouse Tale, T-A-I-L, which was very similar to what Spiegelman was trying to do, to use mice and cats to tell a story about the Jews. And Spiegelman thought that if he didn't put something out before the film came out, his original idea would be taken over by the film directors. So he had finished half of the book, and he published it in 1986, the year the film came out, but he beat the film by a few months, so he was the first. And then later on, he finished the rest of the book, and he came out with the second part. So this page then shows from MAUS 1 that 62% of the time, you find 4 rows in his page layout. And in MAUS 2, it's 78% of the time that you find 4 rows. So we can establish that the basic part of the basic meter would be 4 rows, since it appears more often than not. What happens to the other percentage? Well, they have sometimes 5 rows, sometimes 6, sometimes 7, sometimes 8, and even 9, which shows that there's variety, as in any novel. You can't have consistently the same meter throughout. It gets boring. You have to vary it. And it's also important to know when it varies and to ask the question why it varies. What difference does it do to the meaning when he varies the meter? So 4 then is established as the rows that are used more often. Now, if you do that with the panels also, we find out that 72% of the time in both works, he uses 8 panels. And the remainder, 28%, again, he uses 6, 7, or 9 panels. So then the meter is established as 4, period, 8. That's the regular meter, 4 rows and 8 panels. And everything else that you find as you're reading the novel becomes something that you have to look at closely and always say, why did he decide to do this at this particular point? What does it mean? What does it add to the novel? What comes after that, the description of the panels, is something that you add later on to show how those panels are used. Are they wide? Are they short? Are they long? And etc. On the right side here, you do the same thing now to discover the structure. There are 296 pages, and this is color-coded so that green, I have green representing panel pages that use both the present and the past. I use blue to represent present time, pages that talk specifically about the present. And black is used to show pages that use the past. The red are merely the dividers, chapter dividers, where they don't have panels. They're merely sheets that tell you it's chapter 1, chapter 2, etc. And if you look closely at this page, you discover certain things. For example, notice how many chapters I'm dealing on this page with. And you'll notice that every chapter ends with panels that are in present time, and the new chapter begins with panels that are in present time. And this happens throughout, in every chapter. And it so happens, it happens throughout the entire book. So he ends in each chapter in the present, and he begins the new chapter in the present. Then you'll notice after the present, he goes slowly to the past because he uses green. That's both present and past. And he does that for a number of pages till he finally is deep in the past. Then he starts coming out of the past again with the present, and then he goes back to the past. So he always comes up in the present to relieve the reader from the horrors that he's explaining in the black part, in the past, and that's a pattern. So you notice then how he weaves past and present and how structured it is throughout the entire novel. So by combining past and present episodes within a page, or periodically interrupting the Holocaust narrative with present-day scenes, makes it easier for the reader to accept and contemplate the horrors that are depicted within these panels. Now from this, I have 2-page layouts here. And the thing I want to emphasize in the contrast, over here, you see a page that's all in present time. It takes place in the Catskills, where Art Spiegelman, who is referred to as Artie in the cartoon pictures, goes to visit his father and his second wife, Mala. Notice how uniform the panels are. The same size throughout. Notice the shading, how light it is throughout. Because it's a present, they're unencumbered. You can read it very straightforward when you're reading the present, but look what happens when he's talking about the past. This is a panel from the past. How much darker it is. Look at here, how the frames or the panels change. Look at the frame border here, how jagged it is to kind of represent what's going on. Look at the writing, the type, how it becomes darker and a higher pitch. So that you still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 here, 4, 7. You do have gutters here. Here they're confused, becomes more existential. The angles are different. The figures are drawn different, where here they're all very uniform. So the very layout shows you the difference between a life of freedom and a life spent in the prisons. And this happens again throughout the entire book. This is a different layout. In 1972, Spiegelman did a 4-page spread about his mother's suicide, who committed suicide in 1967. And this was the seed for the whole work. But it was published separately, and he includes it in this novel later on in the 80s. So the thing here, this is done in German expressionist woodblock style. And look how the characters are drawn here. Here he doesn't use animals. He uses actual faces. And I have taken one of the panels here and blown it up so you can see it here. This is the panel that caused a lot of trouble with this book, because in Tennessee, this book was taken off the reading list for 8th graders. And it was taken off the list for 8th graders, mostly because of this panel. The school board decided that there was nakedness shown here, the woman in the tub who is committing suicide, and also words like bitch and menopausal depression. And because of those particular words, they withdrew the novel from the reading list. The interesting thing is that this shows the psychology of Spiegelman himself when his mother died. Look, for instance, in this little picture here. He's in bed being read a bedtime story by his mother, but he's wearing a prisoner's uniform as pajamas, which means that although he's not part of the Holocaust, he's a second-generation Holocaust survivor, the Holocaust has a great effect on him because his parents went through this. And the Holocaust is always in his mind. And when he's thinking about his mother killing himself, he's thinking, he says, oh, it must have been menopausal depression. And then you see her in the tub. Here he says Hitler did it because of the Holocaust. Here he merely calls out mommy. And here he turns against his mother by saying, bitch, look what you've done to me. And again, you see him as an adult, but still in a prison outfit. So he carries the Holocaust with him. He can't get rid of it. Here you see an arm with the numbers on it, his mother's arm. And here, over here, he feels like he's in prison himself. And the last word he says here is, you murdered me, Mommy, and you left me here to take the rap, as if he's imprisoned by what he did. So you see how the styles can change to fit what the author is trying to say. Now I can analyze a few of these pages with what I've already said. This particular page that you see on this side is taken from the first page of the second book, from a chapter that is called Auschwitz, Time Flies. And there's a pun on this because he means that, as it says up here, time itself moves very fast, it flies. But he also refers to these flies that you see throughout that are coming from the stench of the rotting bodies that you see here. So as he's sitting on his drawing board in New York, drawing, he is imagining these things. It's as if he's sitting on top of these people that have died at Auschwitz, and he's depressed in trying to write about this. This is dealing now with the third level of the narrative, where the author is contemplating his work and whether he can write the Holocaust at the same time that he has written it, and we're reading about it. So out of the window, his New York window, he sees barbed wire, he sees a guardhouse, he sees the dead Jews down here, he sees flies running all around. And what you have here also is he's thinking of all the things that have gone wrong with him or what has happened up to this point. And you notice that the chronology is all mixed up. For example, he says at the very beginning, he says, Vladik is dead in 1982. He died of a heart attack, his father. Then he says Vladik Tinsman was a tinsman in Auschwitz in spring 1944. So he goes from 82 to 1944. Then he says Art, meaning himself, started work on this page in 1987. Then he says in 1987, also his wife and he were expecting their first child. Then between May 16, 1944 and May 26, 1944, over 100,000 Hungarian Jews were gassed in Auschwitz, representing all this. And then he goes back to 86. After 8 years of work, MAUS 1 was published. May 1968, Anja, that's his mother, killed herself. And then his last words here are, lately I've been feeling depressed. And he's also feeling depressed because off the page, on this balloon, we hear a voice that says, all right, Mr. Spiegelman, we're ready to shoot. Evidently, he's being interviewed. And he's also depressed because the work that he's trying to do, which he thinks is serious, is already being commercialized by TV. Someone wants the movie rights to this book. Someone else wants to make some kind of sweatshirts or shirts to sell. And all of this bothers him because he thought that he was trying to do a serious work. So his thoughts about his very art are part of the story that he tells about his father and himself. This frame is an enlargement of this one, part of this one, and it's used by the publishers to talk about the artist as a book cover. But what's interesting, there are a number of things here. I've drawn this line myself, that the one you see here, diagonal, because it goes from this packet of cigarettes to the smoke of his cigarette to this tower, which is part of the crematorium where Jews were being burned. And if you look closely, and in all of these panels, you have to look very closely at what he's drawing. It looks like he's smoking camels, but if you look closely, it says cremo lights, crematorium lights, the cigarettes are called. And they're connected to what he's smoking, that the very air he breathes, the very smoke, he's a chain smoker, reminds him of the Holocaust, and that smoke that comes out of the cigarettes connects to the smoke that is coming out of the crematoria. Now that's something that he does also throughout this book. He connects things in this particular way. This is another two layouts here. This one, where he's telling his son about his mother's family and how they were all lost during the war. And on this page, he talks about his family and how they were lost. The mother's family, there's a lot of photographs that remain, and they're going through a box of photographs, and he's talking about how all of these people represented in the photographs disappeared in Auschwitz. And as he's talking about them, notice that they begin to cover him up completely. Memories are taking over here because all these pictures represent memories. And it starts out with the panels, and by the time you get down here, you lose sight of the panels because these photographs completely obliterate the picture. On this side, because he doesn't have photographs of his family, none have survived, he only has one or two you can see at his feet. They're just a few. It's done differently. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 panels, but notice that by the third panel, the rest of them are filled with parts of Vladik's body. Here's his main body with his hands, his feet over here. Here are his shoes and his feet. So he's overpowered by depression that fills almost 3/4 of this page as he's talking about all the relatives that he lost, and he doesn't even have a picture to remember them by, except his youngest brother. There was one picture, and that picture is superimposed on one of the frame, so it pops out at the audience as you're reading. It's top of a frame. And over here are the only 3 real pictures in the novel, in the book. And they're the 3 people, of course, the main characters. Up here is Anja, the mother, and she has her hand on Art Spiegelman's head as he remembers her. This is the brother that died at 4 years of age, with whom he is constantly compared, because he was a perfect child. He died at 4. He was no problem at all. But Art Spiegelman lived to be a teenager and an adult, etc., and did many things. He smoked weed, he did all kinds of things, and he's always compared. By comparison, this was the perfect child. And this is Art Spiegelman himself. The interesting thing here is that he took this picture the moment he got out of Auschwitz, and he went into a town where there was a photo booth that you could wear a brand new prisoner's uniform to take a picture. And it's included here because it tells you even right after the war, the Holocaust was being commercialized. Here, the booths already have, people can come in and dress as a prisoner and have their pictures taken. and that's why he includes this. But also, it's important that the intrusion of these three photographs in MAUS yanks the reader out of the comic style of the rest of the book and offers a challenge to the animal fable which the reader has become familiar with throughout the remainder of the book. Now, this is interesting and shows you the sophistication of the novel, because there's a literary device that's called metalepsis, which works better in a graphic novel than it does in a standard book. It can be handled not better, and there are two forms of this device, metalepsis. I show one here, which is called narrative metalepsis, and another one here, which is oral graphic metalepsis. Metalepsis means the transition from one narrative level to another without the benefit of narration, sometimes referred to as a rupture or as a sippage from one narrative level to another alternate world or another level. Here, to explain this, what you see over here is a page in present time. Again, notice the more orderly arrangement of the panels, where Art Spiegelman, as I said, called Artie in the comic book, and his wife are traveling to the Catskills from New York to visit Vladik, the father. And they're in the car talking. The larger panel sets the scene. You see the cars moving, so you know they're in a car and they're traveling someplace. Here they're inside the car, so this is the larger panel. And Art Spiegelman is doing the talking. And what he's saying concerns his work. He's worried. He's saying, can I really handle writing a comic book on the Holocaust and using mice or masks of mice to tell my story? Can I carry it off? Is it going to work? Which means that here, he's both the character in the comic book, that's one level, but he's also the character in real life, where he's talking about whether he can handle what he has already done. That's what metalepsis is. Two narrative levels are occurring at the same time. And you know that because towards the end, he says, see what I mean? He says to his wife, in real life, you'd never have let me talk this long without interrupting. And she says, light me a cigarette. So he's talking as if he's the artist working on something that has already been completed. But he's also the character, Artie, the son of Vladik, who is going to see his father. That's narrative metalepsis. And this is very hard to achieve in regular prose, but much easier when you can do it with images. Here you have the same type of metalepsis, except it's called oral. Here you see a sketchbook where the artist, Art Spiegelman, is trying to represent his wife, who is French. And he's saying throughout, should I represent you as a mouse, or should I represent you as a frog, or a rabbit, or another kind of animal that he sketched here? Now, throughout the novel, the wife is always represented with a striped shirt like this and a mouse mask, as you see her here. So here in this panel, Spiegelman, the author, Artie here, is asking her how she should be represented, where she's already represented because we're reading the comic and we see how he represents her as a mouse throughout. But he's considering here how to do it. It's another narrative level. It's something that happened before he did all this. But he's doing it at the same time that he's doing all this. That's oral metalepsis because they're discussing it. And you can see here, he's saying, what are you doing? Trying to figure out how to draw you. But she's already drawn. And this is something that's unique to the graphic novel that Spiegelman can achieve and other authors in regular prose cannot. Here I have some other examples of what this novel can do. On the far left there is a layout page that comes directly after the one I've shown, where Spiegelman is sitting on his desk drawing with all the dead people underneath, the dead mice. This is the following page. And you notice here, because he says it in that last panel, he says, I'm feeling depressed. Here graphically, you see his depression because he shrinks. He becomes a child. He's sitting in his chair that he can hardly get off of because he's made to feel small by all the people that are trying to get him to commercialize his work. And he says that he has an appointment to go to his shrink, who is also a survivor. And he holds evening hours. Pavel is his name. So we see him here getting off his chair and going through the streets to his appointment. And the streets are filled with the dead bodies of Jews because that's what he's thinking. That's what plagues him. That's what on his mind constantly. But at the same time that he's doing that, he stops to say that his shrink is fond of dogs and cats. And he collects dogs and cats. And then he stops and narrates here and says, can I mention this, or does it completely louse up my metaphor? That is, here I'm using cats and mice to represent the Jews and Germans, but all of a sudden he undermines this by talking about real cats and mice. So that in that way he's anthropomorphizing his characters. He's making them more human by talking in this way. And he even stops at a point down here as he's sitting in the office and says, look, there's a picture of a cat on the doctor's desk. And he says, framed photo of a pet cat. And then he says, really, with exclamation point, or how ridiculous. This guy's going too far. So he's constantly mentioning these animals to undermine the fact that he's using them as a metaphor for his work. And here, the same thing is shown. Here, his wife Anja and he are hiding from the Nazis in a cellar. And she screams. And she screams because she thinks she saw a rat. And Vladek tries to put her at ease by saying, it's only a mouse, don't worry. But remember, they're already in mice costumes. They're already being represented as mice. But the mice are afraid of mice, which again anthropomorphizes the characters. And you also see the panel when we come to the present where you see Vladek sitting in a chair talking to his son. It's borderless. It's lighter than these panels which take place in the cellar during the occupation. And then the emphasis is, of course, on the problem, the rat, that Anja sees and screams. In this panel, just a single panel, you see how sometimes he bridges past and present. The son, Artie, is lying, listening, and writing on his pad what his father is telling him about the time when he was in the Polish army. And over here you have a picture framed again when he was a soldier in the Polish army. But notice how Artie is lined. Half of his body is in 1939, and the other half of his body is in 1958, over here. So the past and present are bridged in one large panel with this insert, another panel on it, which is in the past. But the way it's drawn, he brings the past and present together. And another thing he does, although they wear masks or mice masks, but the rest of them are human, as you can see, only the face, to make all the faces the same, so he doesn't have to deal with any real faces. They all look alike. And they're not very graphic. I mean, you don't see too many features on the faces. They're very plain. Sometimes when he wants to emphasize the Jewishness of a character, you see a tail, a mouse tail. You don't see the tail in most cases. Only when he wants to emphasize the person's Jewishness at that particular time do you have that. So in all of these, he's trying to undermine the metaphor that he's using, which is the animals. This is another interesting with angles. Look at this, 2 pages here. And it also shows you not only the angles that he uses here, but the business that goes on in the panels. The visuals are not an illustration of what is being said. They add to what is being said. The words are separate from the visuals. You have to combine the two together to make sense. But first this, you have this large panel here that takes up the whole 2 rows, if you were to have 4 rows here, because you have 1, 2, 3 here, and you have this whole panel, which shows Wladek coming back from the Polish army to his home, where his relatives, his extended family, are giving a dinner for him to welcome him home, and they're still well off. They still look wealthy. They've spread a big table here. They're talking about social and political conditions that are still okay, even though they're hurting some. The Germans haven't really done too much to them yet. They haven't taken away their wealth. But look at the angle that is used. We're looking down from above through a window pane with all these lines that give you the impression of they're being imprisoned. They're already in prison. They're behind bars. And you're seeing this very festive scene where everything seems to be going fine through the bars. And in a few pages, you're going to see that they're all going to be rounded up and taken to Auschwitz. But this is represented long before anything happens. And then in the rest of the panels here, he merely describes the various people sitting around the table, aunts and uncles and brothers and in-laws, etc. And he does the same on this page. They're still talking about the situation. Things are hard for them. They still have food, but it's harder to get. That's what the words are saying. But if you look closely at the table and what's going on, you'll notice in the first one here, Wladek is sitting with his wife, and the little boy that dies at the age of 4 is there. And while the people are talking, the little boy takes his dish and dumps it upside down on the table. Nobody has said anything about that. That's only in the visuals. The discussion has to be on social and political issues. So the business is all the graphic artist, the authors. And you have to ask, why is he doing that? He's drawing all of this. Why this business? Why is the kid dumping his food on the table? Why is his mother here slapping him because he did that. And then he begins to cry. And then she's wiping the table. So there's all kinds of business going here. And you have to ask, what does that add to the story? Well, we know from reading most of MAUS that Spiegelman is always being compared to his dead brother. His dead brother was an angel. He died at 4. He's harder to handle as a kid, that is Art Spiegelman. He's jealous of his brother. He says so outright at times. He's tired of having his picture in the house and being pointed to and say, why can't you be like he was? He's confused at times by his father by calling him Richu instead of Art. And this shows the psychological state of the artist himself, where he's talking about himself. That's the second level. That's the autobiographical level of Art Spiegelman, at the same that he's writing the biographical level of his father, and the third level where he's commenting on the very art that he's creating at the same time. And this is shown on this frame too, in a different way. Here you have the present, and the father and the son are walking and discussing the Holocaust. What you see, first of all, that I guess has already been said, is that the prisoners are marching at the camp, and at the same time, behind them, there's an orchestra playing as they're marching. And we have at the top, the narration says, each day I marched to work and hoped again I'll see someone that he remembers. So the artist is drawing what his father is saying, how they marched. But then the son says, I just read about the camp orchestra that played as you marched out the gate. And Vladik says, an orchestra? I don't know anything about an orchestra. So the son has to redraw the panel to hide the orchestra because the father says, no, there was no orchestra. But he doesn't hide it completely. There's the top of the cello. There's the baton of the director. So he leaves it in there. Now that's a comment on the son-father relationship. And you see the conversation going on here. I don't know, but it's very well documented, says Spiegelman. I read about it. He knows the Holocaust. He's not only telling his father's story, but the images that he draws come from research. But the father says, no. At the gate, I heard only guards shouting. There was no orchestra. So here, the son is correcting the father, or is making a statement that everything that Vladik says isn't necessarily so, because he's saying it from memory, the way he remembers it and the way he sees it. But it doesn't necessarily have to be so, which leads to the question, can the Holocaust be written about? Can anybody write it? What is the truth? Another thing is that an artist, as Vladik is speaking, he has to visualize certain things. When he's visualizing what his father is saying, how does he know how many people, prisoners, were walking in a row? Were there 4 per row, 5, 3? What were the conditions? What did they look like? What did the guards wear? What did the prisoners wear? What was the place like? All those questions have to be answered by the artist. But they come from the imagination or from his research. The father doesn't say anything about that. The only thing he says, every morning we marched to work. How did they march? Where did they march? All that is left up to the artist, which makes it somewhere fictitious again. And that's the point that is made here. This has to do with metaphors, which is interesting. Look at this, for example. Again, nothing is said here. All that Vladik is saying, he's talking about his experiences. This is the present. He's saying that I saw myself that people were gassed. He mentioned there, he says, you heard about the gas, but I'm telling you, not rumors, but only what I really saw. And he stops. Well, what did he see? You're not told, but there's an image of a smokestack coming right after that, which implies to the reader that what he saw is people being gassed and killed. But the interesting thing is, notice how the smokestack here goes beyond its frame. It moves beyond its frame and touches the frame above it, so that the cigarette smoke of Art Spiegelman becomes the very smoke of the crematorium. And that's why it cuts through its frame in order to show that. To show then the state that the artist is in, that he's constantly thinking of that. Even when he's smoking, the very air he breathes is that of the Holocaust. As a second generation survivor, this is ingrained in him now. And a scene like this shows that. And you have these smokestacks appearing periodically throughout the book. Here, for example, Vladik is talking about that when he visited Birkenau, which is next to Auschwitz, he noticed that they were bringing in many Hungarians were coming in. And he doesn't say much about it. He says thousands, hundreds of thousands of Hungarians were arriving there at this time. And he stops. He doesn't say what happened to them, but by having the narration below the smokestack tells you, the reader, what he doesn't say, that they were there to be burned in the ovens, as you see here again. And the same thing happens over here. Here they're walking along in the Catskills, and Vladik is telling his son how people were separated in Auschwitz, called the selection, how they were selected. And he's demonstrating. This is in present time. He's saying, they told us, turn left. So you turn left, then turn left again, and then turn left again. And the next left is in past time, and he's naked, standing before the doctors who are examining him. And here is the point of the whole page layout, the selection, where people come in to see what their health is. And he says down here again, he makes a statement. He says, when first I came, I was very strong then and came well to the good side. There's a good side, there's a bad side. So if you're healthy, you go over here. If you're not healthy, you go over here. That's all he says. But then you see the smokestacks again. And underneath it says, the ones that had not so lucky, he speaks in broken English, the SS wrote down their names and they went to the other side. Well, the other side is the ovens. So either you're healthy to work or you're not, and you go to the other side. The image finishes the comment. I see my time is almost up, so I'm going to skip a little or shorten things here. Here, what's interesting, what you see, some other things that he does, when he talks about Anja, his wife, and himself walking through the streets trying to find some place to hide, you notice that the streets become a swastika, that the Nazis are everywhere. You can't get away. And even when you only show part of a street, you can see from the way it's laid out that this couple is standing about here, and you see this part, and you see a little of this part, and a little of this part, and this. So it's always the swastika. that you see here. Here you notice that they try to walk through the streets by wearing pig masks, so they'll be taken as Poles. But some of them look Jewish, and the mask doesn't do much. And there's the tail again. If you can hide your Jewishness, you always have a tail. Here, they're in the Catskills, overrun by flies. It's evening, it's summertime, and Art Spiegelman is spraying the flies. Well, the moment he sprays the flies, what you see is Zyklon B, or that's what's in your mind because you've had that mentioned before. So you're always reminded of these things by the normal actions they do. There are a lot of circles in the work, which is interesting. Here, for example, are two lovers, Vladik and Anja, meeting for the first time after the war. And you see the circle behind them, which could be a moon. It could be a spotlight that spotlights the lovers. But the idea of the swastika is always there because the circle in most of the book is used with the swastika. So when you have the circle without, it's always implied anyway, and it's in the reader's mind. Or you have the circle of the cycle. Every time Vladik tells his story, he's writing his exercise cycle, so that the cycle wheel becomes the film reel that's telling the story, starts up the story. And when he stops, well, it's enough for today. Yes, Artie? The wheel has stopped. When it starts again, and this appears everywhere, throughout, and the spotlight appears everywhere, so that it establishes itself that you can take it as a moon, you can take it as something romantic, but it reminds one of the swastika. I'm just going to mention this. These are the diagrams that I mentioned he uses throughout to make the story more realistic. Every so often he stops and shows a diagram. Here are 3 diagrams within 10 pages apart, and you notice how they progress. The first is very mild, how to stitch a shoe, when Vladik pretends to be a shoeman to repair shoes. The next one shows the layout of the furnaces. The next one, actually, this comes at the very end of the book, shows how people are guessed in the ovens. And it's the first time in large letters that Vladik says enough of this. So the way the pictures are structured, there are about a dozen of these diagrams. They progress, they get worse as you go along, more horrific than the ones before them. And then I'm almost done. One more thing that I have here to talk about, so I'll jump to that. This shows merely some metaphors. Remember that there were trains that were going back and forth transporting people to the ovens. So every time you have a train, even if it's not a transport train, it can be any kind of train, it reminds you of that. And you have these long panels. So they crisscross throughout the entire novel to remind you of the trains that were going back and forth. And this merely shows when they're caught how the panel becomes more existential again and more horrific and more confused to give you the idea of what's going on. This merely shows the, I won't go into this, but the balloons and lines. Different balloons used for the dialogue create different expressions, even nonverbal expressions, as you see here, that you can create. And lines, the way lines are used, can create different meanings. For example, I've marked 4 of them there. I have a comic from Walt Disney, one from Dick Tracy that you see up there. And let me just mention those so you get an idea. Notice that the bold lines that are used here and the obtuse angles, the heavy black graphics, suggest Grimm, Deadly World of Adults, as in a Dick Tracy comic, or as here, Uncle Scrooge, gentle curves and open lines, such as you find in the Disney comics, convey a feeling of whimsy, youth, innocence. When you get to Jules Pfeiffer, as you see here, uneven lines try to depict the inner struggles of modern life. Or you saw this in Spiegelman when he was writing about his mother. These deliberate expressionistic lines depict a true life horror story. So by the way you shade and the kind of lines you use, these are various comic artists and their work, you can create different expressions, different qualities. And this is my last page. These are the last 2 pages of MAUS 1 and MAUS 2. This is the last page of the first volume. Notice that this is the largest panel in the entire MAUS 1. It doesn't have any kind of borders. It bleeds off the page, and it actually extends all the way up. And these 3 frames are superimposed on this larger one, which is the truck bringing in the prisoners to Auschwitz for the first time. See how cramped they are. Here the frames become smaller. And here, as I said, they bleed off the page because there are no boundaries. Once you're here forever. So there's no end. It just goes on. So the frame makes a comment about what you see. Here is the last page of the novel in MAUS 2. And you see this that you saw before, Vladik and Anja meeting under the moon, which reminds the swastika, but they're saying, more I don't need to tell you. We were both very happy and lived happy, happy ever after. But here they're dead. The irony of superimposing these 2 things together. Here it shows something about the father-son relations again. Vladik is in bed. He says, enough for today, Artie. But he doesn't say Artie. He says, I'm tired from talking Richu. And it's enough stories for now. He mistakes, again, his son for the dead brother, which always bothers Spiegelman here. So even at the very end, his father, he can't really get that close to his father. That's what's implied. And then you have the gravestone, which shows the mother's death, the father first, 1982, the mother, 1968, and then Spiegelman himself signs his name at the bottom as if the tombstone is crushing him, and he gives the dates that it took him to write the novel, 1978 to 1991. So in a way, metaphorically, the Holocaust has killed him, just like it has his parents, by putting this in one place. So that's one way of looking at the novel. And if you look closely throughout the 296 pages, you can see why it won the Pulitzer Prize. I'm finished, thank you.
If there are questions, I'll bring a mic to whoever has a question. Raise your hand. Ah,
Oh, question.
Costas, which comes first, the story or the layout?
The what?
Which comes first, the story or the layout?
Oh, both. He's recording. First, he recorded his father's experiences in a recorder, and then he sat down to try and see how he could tell his father's story. So his father's experiences came first, and then he tried to find a way of presenting them in a way that would make sense and wouldn't offend people. But you have to read both together. The words have to be supplemented by the pictures. And since he's using these different levels, he wants to tell his story, his relationship to his father at the same time. And he also wants to comment on whether such a work is feasible. So he's juggling three different narratives and weaving them in at the same time and try to make them read as one.
Costas,
There's somebody back there,
I,
John.
I just want to ask,
Oh.
I'm assuming that he did all his own drawings?
Yes,
So he's
he-
really an artist.
he did.
a
Yeah.
Would you call it a cartoon artist? Not really.
Yeah, he says he's not much of an artist. That's one of the reasons why he wanted to use masks, because all the MAUS masks and the others are the same. He doesn't distinguish between one MAUS mask and the other. Whereas if he used real people, he would have to work on their features, and each would have to be different. But then it would make the story more real and harder to take with a topic like this.
Interesting that it's Catskill is where they were, but cats were the Germans. Cats.
Yeah, that's right. That's a pun. The cats kill. Cats kills. And he uses that pun also.
Costas, lots of younger people particularly, but lots of people read graphic novels without any of this background. In other words, they pick it up the same way and they proceed to read it. Can you comment on that? In other words, you've taught us a lot this evening, and it makes increasing the interest and what are you looking for. But the graphics novels themselves have a visceral appeal, an organic appeal.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about
Yeah,
that?
You know, the graphic novel is no different from other novels. There are trashy novels, there are popular novels, there are classic novels. So some graphic novels or extended comics are merely done for entertainment without some of the things I'm talking about, without being bothered with meter or whatever. They just try to draw things that might amuse kids or might make them buy their comics. Whereas a novel like this, which is more serious, has all those things. But then you find the same thing between reading a Dostoevsky novel and reading a bestseller from the New York Times. Some of them are there just to tantalize the person, to read for amusement before going to bed, and some deserve serious study. So now that a graphic novel has come into its own and is being taught at universities, and there are even departments of graphic novels, they're taken more seriously, and more serious books by more serious people are being produced. And then you have to read them in this way. You have to see how these things operate.
if there are no other questions, Costas, I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you.